anyway, so I'm happy to introduce to you our second keynote speaker after an amazing keynote by Gil Weiss yesterday. Alia Al Saji is a second founding mother of critical phenomenology, as I called them yesterday in my opening notes. I'm sure most, if not every one of you, will know her, so I'll keep my introduction short. Alia Al Saji is an associate professor of philosophy at McGill, Montreal in Canada, and she has widely published on feminist phenomenology and decolonial phenomenology of race through engagements with the work of Rousseau, but especially Merleau-Ponty, Bergson, and Fanon, touching upon fundamental issues such as embodiment, intercorporeal embodiment in particular, affectivity, and temporality. More particularly, colonial duration, the effective weight of the past, and hesitation. I have to admit, I'm a huge fan of her work and just wanted to refer to the titles of 5 articles of her that I found particularly inspiring for my own thinking. Some of which I actually had the pleasure of attending as a conference paper at some stage of the drafting process. So here, together, I believe these titles give a good overview of her work. So I simply list them. The last one, I think that was published, or at least that I read, is called Too Late, Fanon, The Dismembered Past and the Phenomenology of Racialized Time. I guess that today's lecture is going to tie into that. It's issued in a volume on Fanon phenomenology and psychology. So there was a 2021 publication. Then there's actually the entry called Durée in the volume that has been referenced already quite a few times these days in the 50 Concepts for Critical Phenomenology, 2019. Then there's this article, Feminist Phenomenology in a Routledge Companion to Feminist Philosophy, 2017. The hugely, I think, influential article, Phenomenology of Hesitation, Interrupting Racializing Habits of Seeing, in 2014. And well, the final article I wish to mention here is the racial, which has been particularly influential for me, is called The Racialization of Muslim Veils, a Philosophical Analysis from 2010. Al Saji has been the co-director of the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, is currently a co-editor of the Symposia of Gender, Race and Philosophy, and she is the Feminist Philosophy section editor of Philosophy Compass. And at present, I believe she's completing a monograph on that is called Hesitation, Critical Phenomenology, Colonial Duration, and the Effective Waste of the Past. Well, without much further ado, I will give the floor to Alia for a talk which is called Interrupting Colonial Duration, from Fanonian dismemberment and politics of refusal to tearing down monuments of colonial past. Thank you.
Thank you. So will you be moderating during the?
I will.
Yeah, okay. And so I think this is about 45 minutes, which is what you told me, and we'll have about half an hour for questions, I think you said.
Yeah,
so
great. It's good.
I'll try, if I start, I'll ask you at different points what time we're at. Okay, so just to, yeah. Okay, so hold on, let me get rid of the bit where I see myself here. Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay. So this is called Interrupting Colonial Duration. So it's going to take that up from Fanonian dismemberment and politics of refusal to tearing down monuments of colonial pasts. Okay, there I can see you all in the room. That's very nice. Okay, so a bit of a long introduction first, and then I have about 4 sections. So some of these are shorter than others, and I will have a video clip to show you as well as some images later on. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you. Thanks to the people doing. Okay. So what is it to live colonial duration through its repetitions, reconfigurations, and snowballing to survive the affective weight of a colonial past? By colonial duration, I mean to conjure both how the colonial past is not left behind, how it coexists with the present in affect, sequelae, institution, and structure, but also the ways colonialism recalcitrantly adapts, rephrasing itself in different guises as it continues to saturate our present. Most importantly, I mean to evoke how the longue durée of colonialism makes a difference for this experience, how despite its projection of a linear timeline of succession, colonial time operates in nonlinear, material, and affective ways through coexistent and interpenetrating bluey dimensions that weigh more heavily, submerge, and debilitate some while buoying up others. I approach this question of colonial duration not through the punctuation of spectacle and event, but through the mundaneity and drift of everyday experience. And I'm obviously thinking of Saidiya Hartman here. I want to attend to one of Fanon's reactions to this colonial duration, his refusal of what is called in Black and White Masks, his refusal of amputation in the context of his experience of cinema. This is a site where disability or debility and racism inextricably fold or loop together as obverse and reverse. While such disability metaphors have been problematized, amputation can be read, I will argue, than a metaphor, as an expansion of what racializing debility means and the heterogeneity of its lived experiences beyond mere lack, making tangible both the prosthetics that colonialism imposes and the range of reactions we can have to it. Now, it may seem from calls for a return to normality and Western governmental declarations of an end to the pandemic, in quotation marks, that, not the pandemic, the end part, okay, that the past 2 years of pandemic time were a suspension of normal time and that the parentheses can now be closed. Yet the threads that wove through that time, its constitutive elan and structuring duration, have continued, indeed intensified in sometimes familiar, sometimes transfigured form as pandemic time, putting in question the desirability of that normality. The linear yet bifurcating timeline that anticipates an open future of possibility for some bodies while foreclosing and projecting backwards as perpetual past the lives and deaths of other bodies meant that we were already living different pandemics. That racialization puts one at higher risk of sequelae and death from COVID-19 has been shown repeatedly, not simply due to its correlation to socioeconomic status, intergenerational housing, frontline and care work, but through the weathering and wearing down that racialized bodies endure, through the ways in which racism erodes and debilitates. Could this be one reason why COVID-19 became cast as endemic rather than epidemic, as a disease to live with rather than suppress, attaching to disposable others, whether in the West or in the global South? This is compounded with the curtailed futurity and scope of mobility that has been normalized as part of disability and chronic illness for anyone with, quote unquote, underlying conditions during the pandemic. You know all this. Endemicity dissipates the public health crisis by casting the level of death and long-term debilitation as socially tolerable. The colonial inheritance of the term, which maybe you don't know about, charts the geographical and temporal mapping of diseases, like for example, cholera, as durational and endemic to certain parts of the world, even as Western countries may experience epidemic, sporadic, and imported events. So under this schema, racism then would become endemic, quotidian in its rephrased, quotidian in its rephrased violence and recalcitrant mundaneity, ignored in all but its most spectacular occurrences, events represented as exceptional to cover over the way racism saturates the atmosphere we breathe. It's been said, to call racism endemic implies not only that the rate of death, debility, and wearing down that colonized and racialized people endure is socially tolerable, but also relegates this violence to background noise, unattended to and uncared for, calling neither for action nor redress. It's been said that the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic is a mass disabling event, and this is repeated quite often. To borrow Jasbir Puar's terminology, I would say that the pandemic amplifies a debilitating colonial duration, making use of public health. So the term that Jasbir Puar uses is debility or debilitating. Making use of, so I'm calling it a debilitating colonial duration, making use of public health policy, vaccine patents, unequal access to care and therapeutics, and selective protection to hide the racism and neo-colonialism unfurled. Here, disability and racism come together in a colonial duration of debility. Yet this is more than a parallel or analogy. It is a conceptual loop or fold that needs to be carefully unfolded and refolded without being flattened, that may give rise to novel connections or desolidarize others. My approach here is hesitant, attentive neither to tear apart nor to conflate mutually constituting and dynamic oppressions. Okay, so long introduction, sorry. My recourse to Fanon's amputation may appear as a turn to an aesthetic register, shifting away from debility as a physical phenomenon. For it is in response to film that Fanon articulates his experience. Yet what Fanon shows is that film, public memorial, artwork, language, and the architecture and layout of our urban environment, built, named, mapped, and maintained on stolen land with the extracted wealth of colonialism and slavery, wears down and erodes the racialized and colonized bodies that navigate them. The aesthetic is inextricably saturated with the ethical and political, with the structures of colonial and racial violence in ways that cannot be disentangled within the lived experience of racialized and colonized bodies. I ask what roots there may be to the interruption of this colonial duration, to making hesitate the colonial past and creating leeway within it. Fanon traces a path of refusal that I deepen by looking at two other, called political aesthetic. I think there's some noise on the, someone's got their mic open. Anne-Sophie?
Oh, sorry.
It's okay, all right. Where was I? Sorry. Yeah, right. Fanon traces a path of refusal that I deepen by looking at two other aesthetic political contexts that I believe show such what such refusal can do. So I'm going to look at, hopefully I'll get to this, a film called Even the Rain from 2010, where there's a question of we'll see, protests about the privatization of water in Bolivia, and a second case, that of the tearing down of the statue of the slaver Edward Colston during the Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol in June 2020, rolling it into the water of Bristol Harbor. So by insisting on imagining otherwise, I think these moments problematize the linear causal story, the weight and fixity, whereby a colonial past determines our present. They uncover possibilities for colonized bodies, for colonized subjects to interrupt, refuse, and intervene in the past, both now and then. So intervene in the past through the now, but also intervene in the past itself, to make that stifling and intransigent colonial past hesitate. I ask after the creation of possibility within the past that these refusals allow. Okay, so my very first section is very short. It's called Colonial Duration and Racial Imaginaries. And again, if you can't hear me or there's any problem, just stop me and I'll clarify or speak louder. Okay, so I'll try to be quick on this one. So a racial imaginary is more than just a collection of stereotypes. It's a mapping that puts racialized and colonized subjects in their place, to quote Fanon, on one side of a temporal, spatial, agential, and conceptual divide. In my reading of Fanon, constructions of race in the social imaginary have more to do with drawing lines of domination and differentiation than with the concrete racialized and colonized lives who are its ostensible objects. Through this othering process, colonized subjects serve as negative mirrors of what modern European, quote unquote, identity takes itself to be. There is an ignorance to racism that's not merely accidental, but that sustains its operations, a forgetting which actively hides racializing mechanisms and misconstrues its objects. And I'm obviously citing a lot of people in the background here. So rather than losing their hold over time, I argue that racial imaginaries dig grooves and ruts as they endure and repeat. They have a snowballing duration that imbues colonialism with the weight of inevitability and forecloses, even actively forgets, other possibilities. I call this colonial duration in order to capture the ongoing rephrasing temporality that characterizes colonialism and racism. To speak of duration here is to refuse to simply leave racism and colonialism to the past in a linear construction of time. It's to emphasize their structuring and destructuring of the present. This is a time that is recalcitrant because it's adaptive. So because it can adapt, it's actually recalcitrant and repeats, that snowballs and intensifies through the weight of its own duration, that entangles us within its folds, but that masks and justifies colonization through a projection of linear progressive time. This projection of time is retrograde, of linear time is retrograde. It actually loops back. It imagines Europe as a pre-existent, coherent territorial formation with a developmental teleology aiming at an open futurity. And it relegates colonized peoples to a perpetual past, sheared off from this linear arrow of temporal progress. Whether conceived as endemically incapable of catching up or as belonging to an alternate self-enclosed and stagnating time before time, they're fated to be left behind. Fanon shows colonial duration to be recalcitrant and mobile, recapitulative and obfuscating. Its recalcitrant relies on an ability to adapt to social time and place, taking on the guise of prevailing norms. Yet colonial imaginaries also cover over this rephrasing. They repress the histories and operations of power which constitute colonialism, remove responsibility from its beneficiary societies and that intergenerationally, and project that guilt onto the backwardness of its colonized others. What's disavowed is the corrosive destructuring and world-destroying power that colonization enacts. Racialized bodies are at once the material and affective labor, the disposable and consumed lives that colonization exploits, to use Fanon's term, citing Aimé Césaire, the fertilizer, and they are the scapegoats upon which the paternalistic need for colonization and its constitutive and institutional violence are projected. Okay, so section 2 is on now Fanon and the refusal of colonial amputation. And this is the largest section of the paper, and then I'll turn to the film and the statues at the end. So, okay, everyone good? Still can hear me okay? Oh, thank you. Thanks for nodding. Okay, so in Black Skin, White Masks, at the end of the chapter entitled The Lived Experience of the Black, L'expérience vécue du Noir, Fanon writes, and so this is a pretty long quote. Hopefully some of you will already be familiar with it. He says, the Negro is a toy in the white man's hands. So in order to break the vicious cycle, he explodes. I cannot go to a film without seeing myself, or actually me rencontrer, encountering myself. I wait for myself. In the interval, just before the film starts, I wait for myself. Those in front of me look at me, spy on me, wait for me. A black bellhop is going to appear. My heart makes my head swim. And he continues on the next paragraph. And so, okay, I've corrected these translations, by the way, so you might hear them a bit differently. So the amputee, which is estropié in French, or maimed soldier, could be translated. So the maimed soldier of the Pacific War says to my brother, he quotes, resign yourself to your color the way I got used to my stump. We are both casualties. Yet, with all my being, I refuse to accept this amputation, or in French, it's actually just, je refuse cette amputation. Okay, and I'm going to go on with the quote a little bit later on in the paper, but for now, I'll stop there. So, for Fanon, there are several senses of waiting here. Waiting is loaded with watching and surveillance, a sense of expectation filled with foreboding, since what is expected is predetermined in advance, and a that evokes a feeling of coming too late, which is the term he uses elsewhere in the chapter, and it's the title of the article that I wrote, of powerlessness to change its received meaning. Here, waiting loses its sense of indeterminacy. It's opening onto an unpredictable future. While Fanon defines himself earlier in the same chapter as one who waits, I investigate my surroundings, I become sensitive. It is precisely this sensitivity and receptivity to context that means that he is affectively overloaded and tetanized under the weight and circulation of racialized images. So at this level, what is felt is weariness and pessimism. But there's a second level to the experience as well. What is made visible, what becomes conscious in the encounter with the screen is the temporal fragmentation that racialization involves. I've argued elsewhere that this racial fragmentation is experienced as lateness and delay. But Fanon's account conveys something more, for this delay occurs even with respect to an image that has not yet appeared. It shows that neither provision nor preparation and effort can ensure timeliness or coevalness. The racialized subject in this particular, I think, experience or passage in Black Skin, White Masks cannot intervene in the sense of what appears. So I'm actually disagreeing with Kara Keeling's reading here of this particular sense of interval, although I actually really like the way she opens up the interval. But I don't think it's happening in Fanon here. This is a delay that cannot be caught up. It means that the racialized viewer is always already late, not only phenomenologically, but ontologically and structurally. So we should remember that the experience of waiting that Fanon describes is both reflexive and intersubjective. Not only does he wait for himself, but that interval is filled by the stereotyped expectations of others in the cinema who watch him. This intersubjective dimension, which mediates the meaning and reception of cultural productions, makes a difference to the experience. And I'll come back to this. I'm going to skip a little bit and come back to the quote. Because I actually have a fair bit to say about amputation. So the subsection here, so this whole section is about Fanon and colonial amputation, and the subsection here is amputation and disability studies. So I want to just go back to the quote, which I read you, and take up the last part of the quote and the rest of what Fanon says, which goes to the end of chapter 5 of Black Skin, White Masks. And again, hopefully some of this is familiar already. So as he says, the maimed soldier of the Pacific War says to my brother, resign yourself to your color, the way I got used to my stump, we are both casualties. Yet with all my being, I refuse this amputation. And so the full quotation, he goes on, I feel my soul as vast as the world, truly a soul as deep as the deepest of rivers. My chest has the power of infinite expansion. I was made to give, and they prescribed for me the humility of the infirm. Yesterday, so infirm here, infirm, is often translated cripple in the text. So just to note that. Yesterday, opening my eyes on the world, I saw the sky turn upon itself. I wanted to rise, but the eviscerated silence fell back upon me, its wings paralyzed. Without responsibility, straddling nothingness and infinity, I began to weep. So here Fanon is remembering the end of the film Home of the Brave from 1949 and reacting to it by poetically recapitulating and reconfiguring in a very poetic way the works of negritude thinkers who have been cited earlier in the chapter. So a lot of the language here is actually coming in and being combined from a number of poems and pieces that he's been talking about earlier in the chapter. Now, Home of the Brave, as you probably know, but I'll just give, I'm not going to give the whole account, but I'll try and do it quickly. Home of the Brave puts forth the hope, and I put that in quotation marks because it's not a, it's a very white hope, that the Black soldier, Peter Moss, can be cured of his disease of racial sensitivity through psychoanalytic treatment. I'll give a little bit of background on the film here. And then I'll have to go a bit more quickly. So during a secret mission on a Japanese invaded island on the Pacific Ocean, Moss, who's the Private Peter Moss, who's the one Black member of this team that go to the island, experiences paralysis and amnesia as a result of seeing his best friend, who's white, Finch, shot next to him, and the guilt of feeling relief at the time. The army psychiatrist tries to convince him that this is a universal reaction to war. relief at surviving, and not due to his friend being about to call him the N-word. So reaction to racism. Moss is cast as oversensitive throughout the film, even as the racist slurs of one of the soldiers in the group snowball. Only Finch eventually, so his friend who dies, only Finch eventually defends him against this onslaught, eventually, even as the others wonder why a racist was included in an army mission with Moss, whose expertise as a topographer was more essential. It's kind of one of those. While the film acknowledges that Moss's sensitivity is a result of the longue durée of racism in the United States and Moss's early experience of it, and while racism is also presented as a disease, so it's presented as a disease and racists are presented as ill as well, it's Moss and Moss's sensitivity cast as a kind of anomaly of affect, quote Fanon, it's Moss who needs to adjust. The end of the film sees Moss, who has mostly recovered from paralysis, compare experiences with Sergeant Mingo, who has lost his right arm during the same mission, and come to a realization, so this is the end point of the film, they come to a realization that they are deep down the same, and this is the language that's used. While the line that Fanon quotes is not to be found verbatim in the original film, and trust me, I've looked for it. So this is one of those sort of like when Deleuze quotes films, he's remembering it, right? He doesn't actually have access to a video of it or something like that at the time. He would have seen it in the cinema when it came out in 1949 or a bit later. While the line that Fanon quotes is not to be found verbatim in the original film, though it may have been in the dubbed version, so that I don't have access to, I think it encapsulates the message of the ending. I thus agree with Julieta Singh's reading of this scene. So in her book, she reads this scene as one of what she calls radical friendship and a futurity marked by new forms of collective embodiment. Both in his positionality as a psychiatrist and as a Black man, oft accused of oversensitivity, Fanon would have found the solution to racism offered by the film, with its individualized focus on the racialized patient and his interracial friendships, its therapeutic solution without structural change, untenable. So abstracting from the film, Fanon's use of amputation has been read by some disability. So I wanted to give enough of the film for us to realize what was going on when he was talking about refusing the amputation there. But abstracting from the film, Fanon's use of amputation has been read by some disability scholars as a disability metaphor that evokes negativity and lack. So I'm going to actually skip this particular section because it's a discussion of who takes him up and who takes him up positively. And there's a few people that read Fanon in passing. So Rosemary Garland Thompson and Ron Amundsen, who criticized Fanon for the using disability metaphor amputation here as specifically designating a negativity and a lack, right? Without the possibility of it becoming something else. And Julieta Singh also criticizes him for desolidarizing, so taking apart ableism and racism. But there's also other readings of Fanon. So if we were to, for example, follow Sami Schalk, so I'm discussing basically within the disability studies literature here, and read the metaphor not as a dead metaphor, so amputation not as a dead metaphor, that but as actually what Schalk calls an extended metaphor, and hence a dynamic metaphor. And if we were to also follow Terry Pickens to look at what the text, how the text speaks of disability without using the term, then I think we can find a lot more there. And there's actually a really creative reading that I want to reference, but I'm not going to, it's in the longer text here, but I'm not going to talk about it, by Tanya Tichkowski, where she uses Fanon's amputation specifically in order to I think of it as making the metaphor hesitate, actually opening up the metaphor for other ways of living, both living and imagining amputation and racialization beyond the sort of colonial remediation of lack and rehabilitation to normalcy that Fanon was being asked to resign himself to. Okay, and so there's a lot more going on, and I cite a lot more people, and there's a question here about whether the term that we should be using is actually disability or debility, taking up just your poor. So disability would be about a kind of, in her sort of context, something that's individualized, that could be asked for rights and accommodations for, and that occurs within a kind of material support network that would that you wouldn't find, or that you would find often in the West in a certain class, that assumes a certain kind of middle class access to healthcare and resources, etc. And debility, on the other hand, is a process that is durational. It's not just an event or an accident that occurs to those other bodies, whether within the West or elsewhere. And her example that she uses is Palestine, that has to do with maiming bodies, that occurs expressly through colonialism and racism, where there's a kind of intentional process of actually maiming and undermining and debilitating bodies. And I think that actually offers a really strong and powerful framework for reading Fanon. But I also want to go beyond Puar. So I'm just summarizing here, but I want to go beyond Puar to the phenomenology that Fanon gives, because Puar is doing a biopolitics and doesn't do a phenomenology of sort of questions of maiming. And I think Fanon is doing something phenomenological here. And so now I'm turning to my own reading. So amputation reconfigured. So instead of reading Fanon's refusal of amputation as an ableist gesture, I think it's worth recontextualizing it through Fanon's past. So the living memory of slavery and colonialism, the white French educational system, racism while his experience of racism while serving in World War II and later studying medicine in France, and through the film to which he is responding and the cinematic experience in France that he is recalling, as well as through the imaginaries that span these contexts. More deeply than I have time for today, this requires dwelling on the multitude of experiences and senses that amputation carries across such contexts. So first, to remember that maiming, branding, and hamstringing were punishments under the Black Code's Code Noir of slavery, a mode of marking and debilitating slaves who run away or revolt. So this would apply to Martinique. And two, to attend to phenomenologies of maiming as experiences of pain, sensing, and affect registered in the flesh. As Brian Mukandi points out, or has argued, we must attend to what he calls the clinical dimensions of amputation as a process, the materiality of the metal saw grinding through flesh and bone. So in this vein, I would say amputation should also be read as a technology of disciplining and readying bodies for colonial prosthesis, debilitating colonized ways of life so that such prosthetics are needed as perceptual, conceptual, and temporal schemas. And I propose that the colonial past and the colonial imaginary more generally should be read as such prosthetics, dimensions through which we have been habituated to perceive. Pasts of pre-colonial life and of colonized resistance and survival then get overwritten, so you say, and I don't think this is just a metaphor, right? So amputated and replaced with a past reconstructed from remnants, selectively preserved in archives and museum and recreated in art and film, a colonially managed and remade past. Yet, I think we can also complicate our understanding of amputation even further by remembering that it may leave behind a phantom, which painfully registers the wounding and remembers the dismembered past. So to recall, you should hear here Sadie Hartman. Beyond prosthesis as supplement, the amputated body schema and its phantom must adjust to and accommodate the colonial prosthetic, if it is to aspire to an illusion of wholeness, to functionality and integration into the colonial world. But this is an ill-fitting prosthesis for colonized subjects. Ankylosed or stuck in its racial schemas, while changeable and slippery in its content, it submerges them without recourse. It weighs them down and pushes them back into a perpetual past and restricts leeway to breathe. Accepting this colonial prosthetic requires a transmutation of the body, contracting and accepting the amputation as an enduring and repeated cut in order to accommodate whiteness, to be able to move through the white world. So I don't think of the amputation that Fanon is talking about as simply a singular accident or event. I'm thinking of it as a continual process of amputating that occurs. And it requires a transmutation of memory, a suppression of colonized ways of living the past, and an acceptance of the necessity and normativity of colonial history. This is an acceptance that the film Home of the Brave demands of its Black protagonist as part of his so-called cure from sensitivity to racism. So, sorry, there's still more to this. Such accommodation and I'm trying to go deeper and deeper into the layers. Such accommodation and acceptance is not possible without violence and affective distortion, a suppression of the ways of life, a flattening of survival, thought, and affect, a tetanization, as Fanon calls it. This recalls another context in which Fanon discusses film in relation to language, sound, and dubbing. So earlier in Black and White Masks, Fanon notes that when contemporary American films are dubbed in French, Black actors are often made to speak in stereotypically constructed dialect, infantilized and simplified. They're made to speak a form of pidgin. In a context where he has shown that speaking correct French is associated with authority and with becoming what he calls quasi blanc, almost white, this dubbing not only racializes the actors, but spreads a racializing soundscape throughout the cinema. Specifically, this forced synchronization of optical and sound images creates a kind of glue, says Fanon, tying the racialized subject to his image, snaring him, imprisoning him as the eternal victim of an essence of an appearance for which he is not responsible. Now, it's not clear, and I haven't been able to find out whether Home of the Brave was dubbed in this way or not. Thus, racialization in the cinema involves a double violence in a kind of Frankenstein, a temporal fragmentation and dismembering where the pieces have been glued back together into a racialized body, what Fanon calls the racial epidermal schema. Undecidedly organism, living body, or cadaver. I argue that there is at once an amputating and a prosthetic violence involved in this dubbing. This casts the Black actors as tied to a backward past and casts Creole as simplified and stagnant, as if it were colonial pidgin, which it isn't, right? Anyway, there's these distinctions between what the differences here. It blocks off not only the possibility that they speak French, but also the possibility that colonized and enslaved languages are languages through which expression and meaning could be created fluently and potentially more inventively. The structuring assumption is that the colonial language, French, is the only possible dimension for access to modernity. So this then forced optical sound dubbing of pidgin that becomes an amputating or prosthetic part of the racialized self, synchronizes racialized subjects, not with the present, but with a constructed, colonized, and already sticky past. Rather than coexistence in the present, we find ourselves fastened to the past in a backward projection, rendering us perpetually late. Elsewhere in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon calls this construction of the past, as you know, a historico-racial schema. Okay, I'll skip the part where I talk about that. While Fanon emphasizes the historicity of this schema as the glue that constitutes the racialized self, it's affectively lived, interiorized, and epidermalized. And we slip into a naturalization of the stereotyped past and of racialized images to the body, so the racial epidermal schema. Okay, so finally, not finally for the paper, but finally for this subsection, what of Fanon's refusal? So I argue that Fanon's refusal, because he says, I refuse this amputation, right? So I argue that Fanon's refusal of colonial amputation can be read as a refusal to accommodate the prosthesis of colonial culture and language to fit into the white world. A refusal to participate in the image of Blackness seen through the colonial imaginary, to don, so to speak, the prosthetic white mask. This is not to say that he aspires to wholeness. To read Fanon's refusal as an ableist gesture assumes a normal body schema, but normal, to which he would be comparing amputation as deficiency, a schema that I believe, in my reading of Fanon at least, he has already shown cannot hold. while refusing the amputation also means refusing the analogical reasoning that equates oppressions and elides their interstices, we should remember that Fanon's refusal is attendant upon amputation and cannot rewind the colonial duration that is structuring his present. And by this, I mean that his experience in the cinema, as his experience in the cinema foretells, he's come too late. The amputation has already taken place. The colonial imaginary has snowballed into ontology and saturates the screen and what lies behind it, right? Even before any image appears. While Fanon can try to catch up within the terms laid out by the white world, his refusal hints, I think, at another potential, the power of waiting, dwelling in slowness and lateness, in sensitivity and spasm, in laughter and mourning, awaiting an opening to make the past hesitate. And I'm not going to go into it right now, but there are two other places where he talks about amputation in Blacks and White Masks, which is, different in the English than in the French, just as a warning. The English translation adds the term amputation in places that it doesn't occur, but at least the Markman translation does. But Fanon also talks about amputation already in the chapter on language and earlier in the chapter on the lived experience of the Black. And in both those places, the amputation, right? And it's about an amputated être, being that one has. So that's my background there. Okay, so with all of this in mind, then I'm moving to the analysis of the film and then the statues. And you're going to be wondering, like, what's the connection here? But hopefully it'll all come together. Okay, so section 3 is then on a film called Even the Rain. It's called Refusal as Reconfiguration of Foreclosed Possibility. So Even the Rain is a Spanish language film from 2010. It's actually a Spanish, French, Mexican co-production. It's set during the water war that erupted due to the privatization of water in Bolivia. This privatization prohibited access to wells, but also the use of water tanks to collect rainwater, hence the title of the film. So Even the Rain was privatized. The film takes place during the uprisings in I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but hopefully it's right. Cochabamba in April 2000, when protesters from the Coalition in Defense of Water and Life were severely repressed by police and army. But this is also a film within a film. A Spanish film crew within the film has arrived to shoot a historical drama about Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1492. The film's director, Sebastian, is focused on representing the crimes of Spanish colonialism and the historical suffering and genocide of indigenous peoples to bring them to the consciousness of Europe. But the choice of Bolivia is, of course, incongruous. Not only is it the wrong part of the Americas, and landlocked, but it lumps together indigenous peoples as fungible, their languages as interchangeable. The film crew know this and admit the choice to be exploitative. Extras can be hired for $2 a day in Bolivia, and indigenous actors can be had in multitudes. A complication for filming, the main actor, who's Daniel, who's cast in the role of Hatue, burned at the stake by the conquistadors, is also one of the leaders of the water uprising, and many of the extras in the film are at the same time protesting. So the clip I'm going to show comes halfway through the film, after we've seen the mise en scène of multiple scenes of subjection, torture, collective punishment, and dismemberment. In particular, the amputation of a hand as punishment for not filling one's quota of gold. These are filmed with seeming empathy and historical accuracy. The director refers back to the journals of Las Casas and Columbus's letters, for instance, and renders them quite literally. But the focus remains in the film on spectacular violence. So I'm going to show this clip. I really hope this works. So please let me know if it doesn't work or if the sound somehow, if the sound isn't synchronized. Okay. Uh-oh, let me do this again. Damn it. Just one second. I need to click on the right bits. Okay, advanced. Share sound. I hope this is okay, and optimize the video clip. All right, let's see. Okay, why am I not? Okay. And how do I put it? Oh, just, okay, so let me know if there's any problems.
Haku! 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 Haku!
Y es una decisión terrible, desgarradora. Ustedes no pueden soportar la idea de que ahí vienen los perros y de que se van a comer a los bebés. Entonces, las vamos a ver hablando con Atuey y cómo comprenden que no hay otra solución, que tienen que tomar esta decisión y la tienen que tomar todas juntas justamente para darse coraje las unas a las otras. Así que van a agarrar a los bebés lentamente, se meten al agua, los sumergen y los ahogan. Bueno, a ver, ¿cómo lo vamos a hacer? Lo vamos a hacer de esta manera, miren. En la primera toma van a entrar con los bebés y apenas lleguen ustedes a la cintura, en ese momento cortamos, paramos y traemos los muñecos que tienen allí, esos muñecos, y intercambiamos a los bebés. ¿Va? ¿Todo bien? ¿Qué está pasando, Daniel? ¿Pasa algo? Oigan, diles que es completamente seguro. No, los bebés ni se van a mojar, ni siquiera se van a mojar. Ustedes van a entrar, apenas tocan a la cintura, cortamos y entran esos muñecos. Mira, a ver, trae los muñecos ahí para que...
Sebastián, dame tiempo. Un momentito nomás. Dame tiempo.
Bueno,
Dame
pero no
tiempo.
tenemos mucho, ¿eh? ¿Qué pasó?
No lo van a hacer.
No, a ver, yo sé que es muy difícil esto, pero no, por favor, tenemos que lograr que lo hagan. Es muy importante para la película.
Sebastián, ni siquiera se pueden imaginar la idea de hacerlo.
No, pero a ver, no me lo estoy inventando. Esto es lo que sucedió. Tenemos que contar lo que pasó. Es muy importante para la película, por favor.
Sebastián, hay cosas más importantes que tu película.
No mames. ¿Qué hago?
Nada. Venga, vamos a por la siguiente escena. ¿Eh?
Okay, so that went okay. You could see it and hear it.
Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but could you perhaps wrap up in about 5 minutes if you want to have about 20-25 minutes?
Yeah, sorry. Can you, I only have about 3 pages left, so
Yeah,
yes.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, but the film went through okay, right?
It is.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you saw it. It's hard to tell from my end. Okay, so Okay, so while Fanon was a spectator in the cinema, in Even the Rain, indigenous actors rewrite the film. So the Quechua people, both the film within a film, they rewrite both the film within the film and the narrative arc of the overall film, since their water uprising was a rare success and the privatization was reversed. The indigenous actors cannot rewind the arrival of Columbus, but they can refuse to leave intact monumental history, even if redemptively recounted, as if colonial history were an unhesitating totality, a fait accompli. Interestingly, their rejection is not of the historical event as epistemic fact, but of the necessity of that fact as an unalterable part of history, to the exclusion of other possibilities. They cannot imagine repeating the drowning of their children. And this refusal to imagine is at once affective, refusing to have a colonial fact configure their affective landscape, and ontological. The fact does not become historical dimension according to which they live their present, a fact that would drown out, through its awful and spectacular violence, their ability to survive that present. But their refusal to imagine also interrupts the enjoyment and pathos of Eurocentric viewers who await yet another scene of suffering to afford an occasion for empathy and confirm their difference from Columbus, even while their societies materially rely on the wealth extracted, lives massacred, and cultures eradicated in that conquest. On my reading, their refusal is what allows the indigenous women to survive and to struggle against multinational and state for water, which is equated in the film to life, as if they could take them on, as if they could take them on. They refuse a completed past without leeway or redress, reactivating within the past foreclosed, so preserved but elided possibilities. Elided not only by Spanish colonialism, but also by one of its well-meaning descendants, Sebastian, the director, who tries to convince them that this was the only possible outcome at the time. Later in the film, Sebastian says of the water war that it is a confrontation that will be forgotten, but that the story of Spanish atrocity, colonial atrocities, and of Columbus that is history. By making these foreclosed possibilities imaginable, the indigenous actors tell a different past, what Ariella Azoulay has called potential history. But they also do more. They unimagine the world historical narrative of European colonialism with its underbelly of colonized and enslaved suffering. They unravel and reweave the past with threads of colonized survival, resistance, care, and intergenerational repair, albeit at great cost. As the wider film shows, to echo Octavia Butler's Dana in Kindred, one does not come back from the past. One cannot survive colonial duration without maiming and loss. I believe that this can be read as a mode of critical fabulation, what Saidiya Hartman recommends in approaching the archive of slavery. It is to make the taken for granted past hesitate, to interrupt, unfold, and refold colonial duration, allowing what might have been, what could have been, to be felt. This is a matter of invention that allows survival. When asked at the end of the film what they will do, Danielle says, survive, making palpable indigenous survival over the centuries of colonialism despite genocide and invisibilization. Okay, and now the very last section, and this is relatively shorter, although I have some images to go with it. So I'm going to try and make this work. Sorry, let's hope this. Okay. Do I need to? Close that. And slides. Sorry, I have to put it on to make it. Let's hope that this works. How do I do this? Nope. Damn it. Okay, sorry. I'm having trouble getting out of this. to the person who can help me, I'm looking at the shared screen and it's not giving me the slideshow. Where do I go? Ah, now it is. Now it is. Sorry. Bring it out first. So it should be all right. Okay. You can see it now?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Okay, and play. Although if I play it, I'm not going to be able to see my text. So how do I do this? All right, I'll show you the images at the end. Sorry. And I'll read this and then just show you the images during the ending. Okay. So relegating colonial monuments to water, the Colston statue. On June 7th, 2020, a Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol toppled the statue of the slaver and head of the Royal African Company, Edward Colston. So he was head of the African Company in the 17th century. The statue was rolled across the cobbles to Bristol Harbour and into the water of the River Avon, drowning the statue in the waters where so many had been violently transported and drowned centuries before. And I'll note that the statue was erected, I think, in 1895, so quite more than a century after Colston had died. In Wretched of the Earth, Fanon describes the colonial world as a world of statues, a world sure of itself, crushing with its stones the backbones of those scarred by the whip, says Fanon. Statues pin down the colonized, teach them, he says, to remain in their place and not overstep its limits. But they also keep the colonized in their time, in abeyance and delay, amplifying and crystallizing the workings of the image on the screen, the waiting that I described earlier in Black and White Masks in terms of the cinema. Statues are a reminder. We are here, says Fanon, statues are a constant reminder of the following. We are here, colonialism says, by the force of the bayonet. They stake a claim through force, not only to land, but to history, memory, and culture. Statues are not merely symbols or representations on this account. They're materializations of colonial violence, of a colonial past that endures in the present. They weigh physically, psychically, and affectively on the lives of the colonized. They polarize and debilitate how colonized peoples can move through space, and they retell colonized pasts as burning defeat and ontological lack. Amputation in need of colonial paternalism and prosthesis. So Colston's statue, after it was rolled into the water, Colston's statue was retrieved from the water days later and transformed into an artifact, part of a temporary exhibit at the Embodied Museum in Bristol, that tried with context and nuanced, according to most accounts, to give a balanced account of Colston, but also to memorialize the balanced account of Colston and to memorialize the history of attempts to remove him through democratic means and his toppling by protesters. The exhibition was the center of a thoughtful public the statue, asking Bristolians and further afield what they wanted to happen to the statue, how they felt about its toppling, and what to do with the plinth, or as it's called, the stump that remained. The commission recommended, as expressed by the large majority of feedback they got, that the statue enter the permanent collection of the Bristol City Council museums, but that it be preserved in its current state, so damaged and graffitied, and exhibited as it had been in Embodied, in the temporary exhibition, lying horizontally. And this is how it was described by one journalist: supine with red paint daubed on its eyes, mouth, and hands. Its coattail and staff are missing, surrounded by placards from the day it was pulled down, and across its 17th century robes is scrawled BLM. 4 white protesters were charged with criminal damage for their part in the toppling and drowning of the statue. I'm going to skip this bit, but they were basically cleared, and that just happened in January this year. And they were cleared not because they said they didn't do it, but because they actually said they did do it, but with a lawful excuse, which was that the statue was offensive, and that being imprisoned for this particular act would be a disproportionate interference with their freedom of expression and assembly rights. So We can go into that if you have questions. Now, in their recommendations for the empty plinth or stump, the Bristol History Commission report recommended the commission of they recommended that there be commissioned temporary artworks and activities, digital or physical, emphasizing the need for periods of intentional emptiness of the plinth. As a prosthetic, Colston's statue was an ankylarist past and an enduring colonial present. A stump without this prosthesis is a reminder of the toppling and drowning, a presence of absence, as someone said. Watching the video of the toppling is a joyous and moving event, reminding us of what Fanon meant by muscular dreams of the colonized. There is something satisfying about seeing Colston's statue horizontal, not only in the position that the enslaved would have occupied on his slave ships, but in the reptilian and animal horizontality that supposedly characterized the pre-cortical development of colonized peoples. Yet Colston is still the center of focus, even with the contextualization of placards from the BLM protest that day. And the assumption that supine bodies are powerless relies on an ableist and humanist ontology of verticality. Statues continue to polarize our lives, even when felled, it seems. They are not discomfited by entry into museums, those most colonial of institutions, acquiring through their entry into museums an additional contemporary cultural relevance. Is there a way to remember the felling without the statue, to witness the joy of the crowd without resurrecting Colston, however supine he may still be, to leave the statue to wait or drown under the weight of water? And I'll just stop there so that there'll be time for questions. And I'm going to show quickly the pictures from the slideshow, which I somehow didn't manage to figure out how to do. So give me just 1 second. Sorry.
Do you need help? Not that I can.
No, I think I can just do it. Now it was because I needed to read.
Instead of sharing a home screen.
No, it's good. You see it?
I think that's what someone.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's working.
Sorry.
Oh, no.
Start. Okay, so I just had some images of
Pretty good.
the toppling. You can all see online. Okay, so that's, how do I get it to, oh yeah, okay. My favorite, dumped in the water. So there was actually quite a bit of time between the toppling and it being rolled down and dumped into the water. And this is of the statue supine. I don't know if it's quite obvious that way, but as exhibited in the museum. So horizontal, and the contextualization with the placards around it. And those are actually around the plinth, which I think was more effective. And then this is before. So what I wanted to just say is this is what I wanted to end on. I thought this was particularly appropriate. This was there were several artistic and political interventions into the statue before it was torn down. And this was one of them, which I thought was good. So I'll stop there. If you need to see any of the images, I can go back. Okay, stop share. It's not letting me stop share. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that one. So there we go.
Thanks, great talk, Alia. And I think I'll just take questions. So, Annelies, yeah. I saw you were nodding quite ferociously at some point.
Like at the microphone. Okay, good.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't have a
Oh,
question.
do you have the camera? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have a question, but a quick comment. I really appreciated the clip that you showed, and that like really powerful moment in the film, within the film. Because I've been thinking a lot about, I'm from South Africa, and I've been thinking a lot about the archive in South Africa and kind of like anthropologized ancestry and the idea of only encountering like your ancestors in colonial administrative texts or like academic encounters by like racist anthropologists, and what is the impact of that as a as an African person, as a Black person, spiritually and psychologically. And so that was such an important moment for me to just kind of see a reflection of what I've been thinking about portrayed in film, because not only do I kind of see it as, as your interpretation, which is so brilliant, but also kind of like, what would it mean to look at that moment as also just like ancestral intervention, around like, the indigenous people and the ancestors as alive and living spiritual beings, just in that moment saying, look, no more, like this is not okay, like we don't want to show this. And that woman, kind of accessing that from a spiritual perspective. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, you keep that's a brilliant reading, I think. And I was thinking of it as a way in which those possibilities, so that, the camera's moving, so that but yes, those lives that are there are continuing to coexist because the past is continuing to coexist. So in this sense, whether ghosts or thinking of them as ghosts or otherwise than ghosts, so just continuing to, they're still there, right? Fanonian, the North African syndrome says that the colonized carries all of his dead compatriots with him all the time. And so there's this sort of sense of, a continuing kind of life, and their ability to now act what they would have wanted to do in the past, but maybe was foreclosed there, but is made possible now, right? So suddenly this is not a dead possibility, right, anymore. This is a way of not just opening up the possibility but also sort of continuing that action that they would have wanted to. It's like a continuation of the action that happens now. And so, yes, thank you for reading it that way. I think that makes so much sense.
I think it indeed resonates beautifully with your own talk, Annalisa, yesterday. So I think that's perfect. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I want to follow up on the last question. It is like, I would like to know your interpretation of this character, like the guide, quote unquote. I think that his name is Luis, or yeah, like we saw him, the guy who told Sebastian that there's, yeah.
The director or the?
No, the guy, the local.
Hatui? Sorry, the Danielle? Which one?
The director.
No.
No, not the director, the local.
Yeah.
Bolivian, Danielle.
Yeah. So he's a very complex character because at the end, when the uprising starts, he does not give back the money to the crew. And I was wondering if you consider, like, if there's also a contestation of private property as a form of colonial violence. And because he's not like the traditional Hollywood hero, he also raises the question about how private property is a form of colonialism. And I think that in the context of the uprisings in Bolivia that también el agua shows, I think that's something that is really present in the indigenous struggles in Bolivia. But as I said, I would like to know your interpretation about this complex character.
Okay, so you clearly know more about about him than I do. So in the film, there's not, as I recall, I can't remember a question of not returning the money. It's just it's sort of like there's a whole, but so I don't know. So this is from what happened in outside of the film, right? Or is it in the film?
Yeah, it is like at the end of the movie that the uprising will start.
Yeah.
They told him, like, but we pay you, so we have to keep shooting. And he said, like, no. And also, I'm not returning you like the money that you paid me.
Oh, I don't think that was in the, maybe it wasn't translated, subtitled in the part that, but it wasn't in the film. I just watched it yesterday, so I don't remember this, but there is a whole question of money. A whole question of money in the film, which is really interesting because, okay, so just recalling that films, to make a film is not just an aesthetic and like, it's not just, you know, creativity, it takes money, or as Deleuze says, right, the time in the film actually is just quantified in terms of money. So there's a whole question about the film being made in Bolivia because of the cheapness of the laborers, but also this whole thing where they're speaking to each other, but not speaking to him. And at one point, the producer is on the phone speaking English and saying, "Oh, look at how cheap the extras are here. You just pay them $2 a day and give them a few things, and they're really happy, and you can get tons of them." And Daniel is there and he actually understands English. So there's a whole question of being underpaid and exploited, again, by this crew that comes from Spain to make the film about colonialism and the need for money, right? Like to save Danielle's daughter at the end of the film, and she actually almost loses a limb. So she almost loses her leg in the uprisings, and the producer has to go and at this point he's sort of this friend, you know, in an odd way, and he basically pays his way through all the roadblocks and all the other stuff and gets her sort of help. But there's a whole question of water, money, life, right? How this is being quantified, and then absolutely, the question of private property is at the center of the contestation here, because the water is being privatized and the wells are being privatized, but also the rain. And so it's all about how both austerity and privatization, so this overwhelming sort of racial colonial capitalism, is continuing today in the same way as they were being asked to give tributes of sort of finding gold and losing a limb as a result, right? So there's a sort of continuation of how this takes place. But Daniel is great because he's not like this ethical, like he doesn't sort of care. They ask him, "Why are you doing this role in the film? You're the head. Is it like to show the evils of colonialism in the past?" And he's like, "No, I'm doing it for the money." I mean, so there's a whole, and that's what I was saying. I was like, no, he's doing it for the money. I mean, they need the money. So what are these people thinking, that there's going to be noble intentions when what you have are people who don't have access to water? It makes no sense, right? If we're at the level of thirst and hunger, and this recalls Fanon again, you can't expect, he says Fanon in one place, and it's kind of these meditations on philosophy from people who are being kept at a level of barely surviving. So it's, yeah. And I'll go back and watch to see where taking the money, which might be more in the Spanish version. So I'll stop.
Thank you. Would you want to respond to that?
Well, if there's other questions.
Okay. Yeah. So are there any other questions? I think we have time for one more. Matthew?
Yes.
Can you come into the camera lens? Or there you go. Hi. Yeah.
Hi. I had a question about your use of Fanon. So if I understand it correctly, if you speak of the prostheses, these are, sorry, I missed a little bit in the beginning of the talk. You actually mean certain Western ways of life, and you also spoke of the language of French language and French culture. So you can consider that to be the prostheses that sort of plugged into the colonized after he's been amputated in terms of his own culture and language and so on. I was actually, I mean, you mainly worked with the text Black Skins, White Masks. Later on, Fanon also wrote this essay on national culture, with which you're probably familiar. And there he develops a more dialectical view of this entire process that the colonized go to in terms of, like he mainly speaks of artists and intellectuals. And I think he also, in a sense, includes himself in that category. And he sort of speaks of the way in which colonized intellectuals or artists, in the first instance, try to assimilate French culture and art. And of course, Fanon has also had this, sort of almost infatuation with French culture and universal values, and also idealized Frenchness in a certain sense. But then the dialectic goes on, and then these intellectual and artists, they realize that despite having assimilated French culture, they will never be really accepted as an equal, which was an experience that a lot of them who then went to fight against in the Second World War. So they realized they would never really be on a par with their French counterparts. And then Fanon describes in the essay on national culture how they actually sort of make the opposite move, in which they wholly identify with the native culture, with their sort of pre-colonial culture. So and Fanon has problems with that. It's of course part of his entire critique of negritude, the negritude movement and poet. And I was just wondering, it seems that Fanon is almost saying that native culture can also become a prosthesis, that is sort of used to compensate for the colonial amputation.
Yeah.
So and obviously there's also the critique of Fanon is usually that Fanon wasn't really African in a sense. I mean, he was born in this more mixed racial, and that for that reason he never really got the negritude's approach, which as those roots. But anyway, I mean, long story short, I was just wondering, could you also see how native culture, or a sort of endorsement of native culture by the colonized, could somehow function as a prosthesis? And obviously the critique of Fanon is that the culture, the native culture, is adopted in a sort of fixed, mortified sense, or in a morbid way. It's not a living culture that is adopted.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think a good place to look for an answer, so both in Wretched of the Earth, which you were citing, but also a Dying Colonialism, or La naissance de la Révolution Algérienne, right? Because I think anything can become a prosthesis. There are no limits on this. This is not just Western. I mean, the examples I was giving was of sort of the reason for the amputation being the sort of need to create this body that would accommodate a prosthesis that was a Western colonial prosthesis, right? Because to basically assimilate in that way is to also have to maim the colonized body. So that's how I was reading the amputation. Because it is a violent act. It's not just that you have to take in and somehow learn French as this other language. You're not just going to, you have to become French in that way, and that requires forgetting within the context of how that works, forgetting and stopping to not speaking Creole anymore, banning Creole from being spoken in the schoolyard between kids, etc., and trying to make them forget as much as possible and get them to. So there's an erasure and an amputation, literally, that occurs with the creation, with the need for this colonial prosthetic. Now, once that colonialism has occurred, of course, that the amputation has already happened. But is it the case that we're always stuck with these colonial prostheses, that the only way of thinking is always going to be through colonial language and colonial terms? And there are some moments in Fanon where he's quite pessimistic about this and sort of wants to reuse French and do something different with it, but he's stuck with French because he also doesn't feel comfortable in Creole. So this is Fanon's problem, that he doesn't feel comfortable in Creole. It's not a problem of Creole, right? And it's not a problem, I think, specifically for Martinicans, because you can think about Glissant or Césaire, or and specifically Glissant, as being open to these multiple languages, etc. Right? Although Glissant does say that Haitian Creole is actually the better alternative. So there's a kind of different ways in which the creativity of Creole can come in, but that's a whole other question. So it's not simply, so we could have what are sort of these, if you like, colonized creations that are created post-colonialism, so within colonialism, but are not simply assimilable to the sort of model that colonialism has. So not French, not perfect French, but something else, right? But we could also have pre-colonial languages, right? Quechua being one of them in the film, right? Which you note was not subtitled. And I think this could be read as either a problem with the film or as a way of positioning the audience, us, as on the side of the colonizers and having not to understand, keeping the opacity of what is the sort of the native language, right? So there's some interesting ways of going there. But what is a question, right? Fanon was actually, what he says about African languages is really interesting. He says they're lucky because they have African languages. They have this access to something that still continues, even though it's changed, etc. Right? He's always suspicious about the ways in which both languages and cultures and rituals, right? Dance, he talks about storytelling, all of this is changed through colonialism and becomes rigidified because there's a defense mechanism that's created, right? And he talks about this in the context of veiling, right? In Algeria, he talks about this in the context of family structures, in the context of, so all of these things that cultural and familial and creative ways of being become stuck through once colonialism comes in, not because they're stuck in and of themselves. That's how colonialism presents them in the stereotypical form, as if they were, as if the family structure, as if cultural productions were just this primitive thing. But stuck because colonialism has come in and attacked them, right? And so there's an attempt to protect them and keep them the same, and they stay the same. And this is the problem that Fanon sees with the way that pre-colonial modes of being occur in colonialism. That doesn't mean that they can't become dynamic. Again, just like veiling, this is why I was referring to, it becomes dynamic for Fanon in the context of the revolution, of the Algerian Revolution. It becomes dynamic in the context once people are actually fighting against colonialism. There's a dynamism that comes back. And in his essay, Racism and Culture, he really presents how this sort of happens and says that the sort of colonized culture can take on this dynamism, can take on this sort of movement of change, can become unglued in a certain sense through basically no longer passively, so basically through resistance, right? Through resistance to colonization. And this is then a prosthetic that one creates for oneself as colonized, racialized peoples that is not necessarily pure, right? Purity is not the question here. It might involve some elements of still colonial, like languages, but it's created in this context. And this is what he says about storytelling in Wretched of the Earth, that the storytellers start to tell these stories and create new myths for the revolution, basically. And so it is definitely possible to create an unstuck prosthetic. This is where this is going in my thinking, right? That hesitates, that is able to be sensitive to its context and to change, and not simply be this sort of stultified, assimilative, and very violent, right, prosthetic that colonialism presents as the only option, right? Okay, so hopefully I responded. But yes, thank you for asking that question, because it really lets me like kind of bring that to the fore. And I think this is what happens with the statue. So take it down, but also you can't just bring it back and have the same stuck kind of statue be there. You need to create stuff around it or create other things. What happens to the plinth is much more interesting actually than what happens to the statue that's put back in the museum, I think. Like what happens in that empty space can be much more interesting and around it. So there's kind of, anyway, sorry. So long.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm afraid we need to close this session. So, well, just a last round of applause.
And can I ask, can you hear me? If the people who ask me questions, would you mind emailing me so I have your names? Because yeah.
We will pass them on to you. Yeah. So
yeah, and also I can
yeah.
then respond more. Yeah, but thank you so much for all your wonderful questions. Thank you for the event and thank you for letting me do this remotely. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.